Hi everyone, welcome! In this video, we're going to talk about how to write Markdown in Jupyter Notebooks. First and foremost, what is Markdown? Well, Markdown is a language. It's not a programming language though, it's what we call a markup language. A markup language is a way of annotating a text document to include hints about how the documents should be displayed. When the markup document is processed, that is displayed, only the formatted text is shown. Now, for the purposes of this guide, we're going to be using Jupyter Notebooks to demonstrate Markdown. That said, you should know that Markdown is not actually Jupyter specific. In fact, many other services and products use it to easily allow for text formatting. According to Wikipedia, the name markup comes from the marking up of paper manuscripts, something that editors do when suggesting corrections. Okay, so that's a fancy name, right? But what is Markdown? Chances are that you've been using it already, you just didn't know it was called that. One place where you might have used Markdown before is if you've ever formatted Slack messages, for example. Markdown is essentially a way to write formatted text. The formatting options that Markdown allows are not actually all that varied. For example, you can't specify font styles, you can't specify colors, but they're powerful enough to significantly increase the readability of a text document. By using Markdown, you can quickly include things like headers, you can include links, images, bold or italic text, paragraphs, ordered lists, unordered lists, a bunch of other things. Now, in this guide, we're going to be using Jupyter Notebooks to demonstrate Markdown. However, please note that Markdown is not Jupyter specific. There are many other services out there and products that use Markdown to allow for easy text formatting. Now, what are some advantages of Markdown? Of course, you can always format text in a text editor, right? So why would you even choose Markdown? Well, first of all, unlike the text format used by many editors, Markdown is in fact just plain text, meaning that it's very, very easy to share between computers. It's not proprietary either, so anyone can use it. It's also very simple, yet quite powerful. There are only a few symbols and rules that you need in order to write Markdown. And last but not least, Markdown is compatible with the web. What I mean by this is that Markdown can be easily converted to HTML so that it can be easily displayed in browsers. In fact, this is exactly what happens in Jupyter Notebooks. Because Jupyter Notebooks are displayed in a browser, the Markdown is actually converted to HTML. And it is the various HTML tags that tell the browser how to actually display the Markdown formatted text. Now, while HTML is technically beyond the scope of this tutorial, I want to give you a few examples of the kind of Markdown to HTML transformations that happen when Markdown is displayed in a Jupyter Notebook. For example, bold text in Markdown becomes plain text inside strong tags in HTML. The browsers then display text inside the strong tags in bold on your computer screen. Images, likewise, are converted to IMG tags. Browsers will then render these tags as images and whatever is inside them. In this video, we're going to talk about when and why you would use a Markdown in a Jupyter Notebook. Markdown is a way to display formatted text. By default, Jupyter Notebook cells are formatted to display code, not text. So without Markdown, there's no easy way to include explanatory texts in your notebook. Of course, you can always include code comments, and you should, but those cannot be formatted. And what about links and images? Jupyter Notebooks are great for presenting research type work. In fact, that's where they have their roots, in presenting scientific work. Consider, for example, this small section of a Jupyter Notebook which introduces the concept of linear regression in classical machine learning. Notice how seamlessly the Markdown and code cells alternate. This allows us to create a presentation that includes both explanatory text as well as executable code. While I could have used Python comments instead of Markdown cells, I argue that Markdown creates a much more enjoyable experience for the reader. So, to summarize, I encourage you to use Markdown in your Jupyter Notebooks whenever you have to include a large body of plain text. That way you can format that text and make it more easy to read through and understand. Now, if you are convinced and want to learn Markdown, let's jump into a quick tutorial. Markdown is super simple, so you really only need a few minutes to become an expert at it. Let's get started. The first thing we need to do in order to be able to write Markdown in a Jupyter Notebook is to create a Markdown cell. As you can see here in this new Jupyter Notebook that I have open, the default cell type is a code cell. You can see it here. If I want to write Markdown instead of code in this cell, I'll have to change the cell type from code to Markdown. Cool, now we can get started writing Markdown. In order to create boldface text, so to mark down a piece of text in bold, all we have to do is type 2 asterisks, the text that we want to write, and another 2 asterisks, like so. This is bold. Now we change the type of the cell again to Markdown, and we can move on. What if we wanted to write italic text? For italics, what we need is an underscore, the text, and another underscore. Ta-da! What if we want to make something both bold and italic? Well, we make it bold first, then we make it italic, then we write the text, then we just wrap it up, and voila, both bold and italic. Let's talk about paragraphs next. Perhaps the most confusing thing about Markdown for beginners are paragraphs. Here's why. If you were to type a simple piece of text in a Markdown cell, you would find that it wouldn't display quite the way you expect it to. Let's give it a shot. For example, if you typed these lines from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet exactly as they appear here, the text is going to be displayed as follows when we execute the cell. It's just a jumble, right? No lines whatsoever, not an actual poem, just a jumble of text. So what happened to the line breaks that we thought we put in there? There's nothing there. Instead, there are 2 separate ways to break lines within Markdown. There are soft breaks and there are hard breaks. Let's look at soft breaks first. If we go back to this passage from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, in order to include soft breaks after each line, what we have to do is type in 2 spaces. 1, 2, after each line. 1, 2, 1, 2, and 1, 2. Now when we execute, voila, we actually have 4 separate lines which are displayed nice and clean. Next, let's talk about the second type of break called a hard break. Hard breaks in Markdown are used to separate paragraphs. You can achieve this in Markdown by simply including a blank line in between the paragraphs. For instance, consider the following Markdown of 2 paragraphs from Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. What do we see here? The first paragraph is written on a few lines, then we have an empty line marked 2 here, and then on the following line we start the second paragraph. If we run this, we notice that there is indeed a space in between the 2 paragraphs. This is what is known as a hard break in Markdown. Next, let's talk about headers. There are 6 header levels in Markdown: H1, H2, H3, all the way to H6. H1 is the largest of the header types, and H6 is the smallest. To write a header, you simply include 1, 2, 3, or up to 6 pound signs before the text that you want to create as a header. Here's an example. If I wanted to write an H1 type header, I would simply write this, For H2 type header, type 2 pound signs. For an H3 header, 3 pound signs. For an H4 header, you guessed it, 4 pound signs. H5 header, 5 pound signs. 4, 5. Now you're noticing something different happening when typing the H5 header, namely that the text is slanted. So the H5 header is italicized. This is just the way Jupyter Notebook implements this particular Markdown header. You'll see the same thing happens with an H6 header. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is an H6. One important thing to note here in all these headers is that I left a space between the last hashtag, the last pound sign, and the beginning of the header text. I did this for the H1 header, I did this for the H2, so on and so forth. One thing to note here is that this space is actually only required for when you write Markdown in Jupyter Notebook. This is not required in Markdown in general, but it's just a quirk within the Jupyter Notebook Markdown implementation. When it comes to links, Markdown allows you to easily insert links into plain text. To do that, you would simply wrap the text of the link, so the anchor text, between square brackets, and then you would wrap the URL between regular parentheses, like so. One thing to note here is that if you are writing an absolute link and not a relative link, you need to remember to include this https:// before the URL to mark it as an absolute link. Otherwise, the link is going to be considered relative. Now, if we run the cell, what do we get? We get the anchor text that we included between the square brackets. This is a link to Adlitera. And we get that anchor text hyperlinked with the URL that we passed. So if I click on this, there's a link which takes me to the Adlitera homepage. Next, images. Adding images to a Jupyter Notebook Markdown cell is actually very similar to adding a link. The only difference is that the square brackets come after an exclamation point, like so. Now, when displaying an image in Markdown, the text between the square brackets, in this case, image of a cat sitting on a chair, becomes the value assigned to the alt attribute of the image. Now, this attribute is actually important for accessibility. Some screen readers use the value of this attribute to describe the image to people who may have difficulty seeing it. So while you could leave it blank, and the image will still show, it's usually a good idea to get in the habit of adding it by including some descriptive text of the image between the square brackets. One thing to note here is that it is important that the URL for the image should be the actual path to where the image is stored. So in this case, the image is stored on cloudinary.com and it is uploaded there, so this entire path represents the image that is going to be displayed. And here it is. Next, we're going to talk about block quotes in Markdown. Block quotes are used to draw attention to quotes from other sources. They're not as common in Jupyter Notebook, but I will introduce them here just in case you need them. To display a block quote, simply include a greater than sign before the text you want to quote, like so. With a greater than sign in front, once we execute this, this is what it looks like. One thing to note is that in this block quote, we included some bold text, the name of Jean-Luc Picard, just so you can see that you can actually combine the various formatting options that Markdown offers within the same structure. In this case, we have the quote that is formatted as a block quote with the author of the quote in boldface text. In Markdown, we have two types of lists available. We have ordered lists and unordered lists. Let's start with the ordered ones. In ordered lists, each list item starts with a number. Now, what's interesting about Markdown and Jupyter Notebooks in particular is that you don't have to include the numbers yourself. You can instead start each list item with 1, for example, and when the Markdown is displayed, the correct number is actually going to be filled in. This feature makes it real easy for you to reorder items without needing to edit any sort of numbers if you need to do so. For example, this would be an ordered list. When we execute it, we get the right order of items, 1, 2, and 3, without actually needing to manually label each item with the correct number. Next, let's talk about unordered lists. Unordered lists are lists that start with a bullet point. They're also really easy to create in Markdown, like so. This is the first bullet for item 1. This is the second bullet for item 2. This is the third bullet for item 3. When we run this cell, we get actual bullet points for each of the items in the list. One interesting thing to note about lists in Markdown is that lists can be nested. For example, you can mix and match them, like so. Start with an unordered list of item 1, and underneath it, let's say we want to subordinate a ordered list and underneath it, further still, we can write another unordered list. This is level 3 of this list. And we can even go even deeper and say we want this to be level 4. Notice that when you hit enter, your cursor actually moves to the same level that you were on before. So right now, because we were on level 4 on the previous line, the next line is also going to start on level 4. If we want to move back, we simply hit Shift Tab, and we will move back one level at a time. So let's say that this is item 2, and we also want something on level 2 here, and something else also on level 2. And then, of course, we can also do item 3. When we execute this, what do we have? We have an unordered list, items 1, 2, and 3. And underneath those, we have one ordered list under item 1, with sub-item 2 having its own unordered list subordinated to it, which includes level 3, and a level 4 below, which is subordinate to level 3. Hopefully this gives you a sense of how easy it is to create lists in Markdown. Also note that Jupyter Notebooks, as you can see here, include syntax highlighting for Markdown, which makes it easy to distinguish between the various levels of a list. I hope you enjoyed this quick guide for how to write Markdown in Jupyter Notebooks. I'll see you next time.